Chitranjali Tiwari, Associate Fellow at the Center for Policy Studies at J.K. Lakshmipat University. It gives me immense pleasure to announce the second session of our speaker series, Impact Talks. And for those of you who are new to our series, on this platform, we invite experts who have contributed significantly towards the policy and development sector through their exemplary work. I would like to invite Dr. Rinki Sarkar today, an independent environmental social scientist, as a guest speaker to talk about the conservation concerns to protect a rare Himalayan pine. A brief introduction of Dr. Sarkar. Her interdisciplinary research engagements seek to unearth the nature, pace, and impact of development and change in the ecologically fragile Himalayan region. In course of her field investigations, she treks into the landscape for gathering ground truth evidence on various dimensions of the natural environment and lives with the local community. She is trained as an economist, and her self-driven research studies have evolved to assume an interdisciplinary thrust for enabling holistic analysis of an interconnected ecosystem. In her course of research engagements, she has also associated herself with premier academic institutions, collaborated with renowned international experts, and presented her research publications across recognized national and global platforms. When she is not engrossed in her solitary field research trails, she enjoys teaching and exposing her students to complex realities of rural and urban realms. She conducts rural field study workshops in Western Himalayan foothills for collaborating students of Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi, and the Worcester Polytechnic, USA, and engages with urban design students at the School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi. In today's session, for the next 50 or 60 minutes, Dr. Sarkar will share with us the outcomes of a research study she was motivated to pursue as she was accidentally exposed to impending threats endangering a rare mountain pine. Her study promotes the importance of such evidence-based research as a prerequisite for designing implementable policies, conservation policies for the state. She will also share with us the challenges she faces as an independent field researcher, as well as the opportunities she sees for young students to pursue a career in this field. So without further ado, I request Dr. Rinki Sarkar to begin introducing us to her world of great Himalayan ranges and the research she does on field. Thank you.
Thank you, Chitranjali. I have a lot of visuals to show, so I am just going to go to my screen sharing. Yeah, just give me a break. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah? Shall I begin? Visible? Great. So I'm going to take the liberty of introducing you to certain natural and human dimensions of the region initially, so that we can contextualize this mountain pound study in a slightly better manner. So let me begin with my first visual presentation, striking Himalayas, majestic Himalayas. These are an outcome of colliding continental plates, a process that geologists refer to as orogenesis. The Himalayas are supposed to be the youngest mountain ranges in the world, of course, 47 million years ago, and they seem to be still moving, 2 centimeters per year and rising at the rate of 5 millimeters per year. And therefore, they are pretty unstable. And the evidence of this comes from the frequent seismic shocks and earthquakes that we witness from time to time. The Himalayan arc extends from Nanga Parbat in the west to Namchibarwa in the east. It's a long expanse of 2,500 kilometers and extends from the foothills to the top and to about a range of 400 kilometers. Now, although this small expanse seems quite minor, in relation to the whole country, there are innumerable environmental zones that are formed as we move from the west to the east and as we access altitudinal belts. For instance, in the west, we find that precipitation is mostly in the form of snow. And as we head towards the eastern parts of the Himalayas, precipitation is attributable to more to rainfall. And as we, if we take the case of forests, for instance, the biodiversity also varies as we move from the foothills to the top parts or the topper end of the mountain ranges. So as we move from the foothills, forests are of subtropical nature, and then when we move higher up, they become temperate in nature, subalpine, and then the tree line occurs, and beyond the tree line, we have these wonderful undulating alpine pastures intercepted by beautiful small water bodies. The pine that we're going to study today, our focus is going to be on, is a subalpine pine, and you can see that I have marked it on this map today. Now, my own research journey began the small, wonderful village in a remote corner of Himachal Pradesh way back in the late 90s. And it was again one of those wandering encounters. And I was dumbstruck by the landscape and the surrounding areas and the people of these places. And I was totally curiosity driven to find out how people lived here and what their occupations were. And so I selected a vantage point inside a temple, and I wanted to conceal myself as an outsider, not to draw too much attention. And therefore, I sat here at this window, pondering across the core of the temple square and the core of which was the core of the village, trying to understand. And here is where my first observations on the day-to-day existence of high altitude Himalayan villages really began, as well as the surrounding natural landscape. Now, when you go to this region, the first thing that struck you and struck me is how human and non-human entities survive in these harsh topographical surroundings, where extreme environmental conditions characterized by climatic extremes, very high daytime, nighttime temperatures, steep slopes, very short growing seasons, lack of soil nutrients, because of continuous soil erosion happens on a daily basis. And I realized through my studies that most living organisms have developed great resilience to these harsh conditions by ingenious forms of adaptation. Let me give you the example, an extreme example of the highest known permanent resident on Earth, the Himalayan jumping spider. It's found at altitudes of 6,700 meters above sea level. What does it rely on? Its prey, stray insects that are blown up the mountainside by wind from lower altitudes. And how has it adapted to survive here? It has fascinating vision, The jumping spider has 4 pairs of eyes. Multiple eyes gives the spider a near 360-degree view of the world, essential for detecting any kind of motion and its prey. It also has evolved fascinating limbs that allows it to jump many more times its size so that it can capture its prey. Now, the Himalayan jumping spider, because it has evolved over centuries to survive in these extreme environments, can only survive in this kind of environment. If you remove it and move it to a tropical landscape, I'm afraid it's likely to perish. And therefore, the fact that it can survive in only a very narrow environmental bandwidth makes it an endemic species. And high rates of endemism really characterize the Himalayas. The Himalayas are a hotspot of endemic species. And these are definitely susceptible to loss of entire communities once there are threats to their survival, because they can only survive only within these narrow environmental bandwidths. The pine that we're going to study today is also an endemic species in the subalpine belts of the Himalayas that I've stated. Now, connected to this is another very concerning idea, which is related to present concerns of climate change. And as you can between two time periods, 1985 and 2017, this recent study illustrates how some of the avian species have become exterminated due to global warming, particularly those that are at the top altitudinal bands. So some of the species in 1985, which are at the lower foothill, which sort of inhabit the lower areas. When warming happens, they have a larger habitat to survive. But the ones that survive at higher altitudes, their environmental zones become smaller and smaller, and the highest ones don't have any place to seek refuge, and so they are likely to become extinct. And this is really the condition of the mountain pine that we are going to look at today, which is extinction, just like this ant shrike depicted in my slide. Of course, the Himalayan ecosystem is extremely interconnected, and symbiotic associations are evident in various spheres. And therefore, it's a very, very fragile ecosystem, and there is a very precise sensitivity of the biota to any kind of stress and disturbance because of all the characteristics that I've just spoken about. Now let's look at the human interface in these mountain spaces. The origin of human habitations in the Himalayas is very difficult to ascertain because there are meager archaeological evidence. No fossil records, no skulls in caves, no communal tombs from which to test bones for age or origin. Some stray accounts of human habitations can be found in Hindu epic references, monastic records, local folklore, and myths. Here, ethnographies of gods actually abound, where the mythical abodes of Shiva are in plenty. Now, it might be logical to therefore assume that most human inhabitants in the Himalayas may have entered from different directions in and around this landscape for different purposes and at different points in history. And I quote from a beautiful recent book by Stephen Alter called The Wild Himalayas. And maybe this sort of movement into the Himalayas started happening something like 7,000 or 10,000 years ago when the glaciers receded, making mountain passes more accessible. And so as a result, when we study the Himalayas today and the human population, it's an extremely complex, it portrays an extremely complex ethnography. Now, there have been other kinds of entities fascinated by the Himalayas. Particularly, the pilgrims have been drawn to these various religious sites. There have been mountaineers and, of course, British explorers who have really penetrated and into the interiors, writing detailed accounts in their gazetteers. For instance, Thomas Skinner was deeply moved by the beauty of the place, mesmerized by the remarkably clean and well-cultivated villages whose terraces are bound by hedges and neatly kept, as they are in England, he says. He was so deeply moved that, he believed that the celebrated scenery of Europe, which poets and painters have immortalized, he felt, but, the Himalayan region by far surpassed this beauty of the English landscapes. Now, most of these Himalayan inhabitants live so close to natural resources that they are, it's very easy to sort of pristine them as ecosystem users. They have to rely on the natural resource base for survival in the surrounding vicinity. And therefore, because of the harsh ecological conditions and the risks of survival, we find that natural endowments have continued to play a very determinant role in influencing economic activities and social organization in this region. For instance, the economic activities and living livelihood patterns have been meticulously tuned to variations in altitude and seasonal changes, and the local native population has relied on a diversified economic base to enable them to, shoulder risks. The social organization and village life has been based on a lot of cooperative spirit, because a lot of activities in these villages require human toil and physical effort, and the population base is extremely sparse, and therefore you have to rely on your neighbors, and therefore collective action and governance through local institutional mechanisms to make these collective action more implementable is a feature that has been in existence, particularly in traditional times, and one can find traces of this even in the present scenario. And as we can see, that varied nature of livelihood adaptations, just like the natural world has adapted to the surrounds, the local population has also adapted to its natural endowments, and a diversity in climate and terrain has resulted in a varied natures of livelihood adaptation. So at the lower foothills, where the Himalayan rivers bring down fertile alluvial soil, you find that the population is reliant on agriculture. And as we move higher, you have agro-pastoral dependence, and in the Tibetan plateau, which is like a cold desert belt, you find a mix of pastoral activities, trade, and irrigated agriculture. Now, the local livelihood systems have been ingeniously carved out. It's immaculate way in which forests are used for energy and also to cater to their agriculture and livestock is worth a while to investigate. They've also tapped traditional water resources in very innovative ways and sustainable ways, not only for potable drinking water purposes for irrigation, but also, and this traditional water mill, which really is a turbine, water moving turbines to enable the grinding of grains to flour, is what a hydropower project actually, the principle which the hydropower projects follow. Even the dwelling units exhibit climate sensitive and earthquake resistant properties for them to survive in these unstable and climate extreme conditions. They've also evolved, they've not really been able to harness ferocious rivers that crisscross the landscape, creating deep gorges, but they have evolved sustainable means of transportation to cross these rivers. Now, it's only the British gazetteers and their immaculate recording of these regions that provides the earliest recorded history of these regions. And in these, the Britishers portray the region as a fragmented political landscape. Small isolated mountain feudatories existed, and for them, emphasis on religious aspects of life was the only means of legitimizing claims to kingship. The local deity played a very important role, and in religion was an institution of local governance itself. These were futile sites for conquest because the isolating tendencies of the natural environment did not permit those hungry to penetrate into these belts and for empire expansions. Therefore, petty kingdoms waxed and waned in these uplands over centuries, and undeterred existence happened over a long period of time. Global interest in understanding these peasant societies can be found in immaculate ethnographic works of Berman, Hammondorf, and Guerrer, anthropologists from America, Austria, as well as Britain, and which gives great accounts of these traditional mountain peasant societies. Now, the advent of external forces in the Himalayas began with the Gorkha invasion in the latter half of the 18th century. The objective of the Gorkhas was, of course, empire expansion. Later, one can feel British impact in the early 19th century, and their objectives was to spread and consolidate their empire in these areas, particularly to seize profitable trade routes to Tibet in adjacent areas of Tibet. And of course, scientific exploration. It is fascinating to see their accounts, detailed accounts of flora and fauna, including the mountain pine that I'll be presenting to you today. And of course, they were very interested in timber exploitation in the Himalayas to cater to their imperial needs for shipbuilding, railways, for setting up their summer capital in Shimla, as well as to sustain and build their cantonments and hill towns all across the Himalayan arc. The post-independence era is marked by development programs. The objective has been to promote connectivity and, of course, modernization and change. Academic impressions of the Himalayas in the 20th century dates back to the late 20th centuries. Because this region was of great strategic importance, researchers, particularly from the Western countries, were not allowed to enter this region for a very long time. But we find that these impressions start emerging around the late mid-70s. And, Ekholm and Myers, when they did their studies in the Nepal Himalayas especially, they came up with really alarmist impressions of the Himalayas at that time, alerting us about how human activities, population growth, deforestation, mining had started damaging the Himalayas in a myriad of ways. But in the late 80s, Ives and Mesley, of course, challenged their perceptions by saying, no, the natural processes in the Himalayas are creating all these, degrading conditions, and these dwarf the tiny impacts of the human activities. As I said, that the Himalayas are a very young mountain range, and they're, creating landslides, shifting, creating seismic activities all the time. And this itself, sort of disturbs the land and the landscape from time to time. However, it may be important and worthwhile to, decipher and infer that the post-80 scenario presents cause for concern, for concern. And maybe the damage that we're seeing in the Himalayas is attributable to a perplexing mix of natural and human factors. The state's lopsided development goals and the native population's insatiable aspirations are reasons for this, for which short-term gains have really been at the priority, while environmental risks and long-term environmental and ecological repercussions have been shunned into the background or just given off as a trade-off. For instance, incessant road construction has created deforestation, has destabilized slopes, created erosion, downslope erosion, and made the region extremely susceptible to natural hazards causing landslides. Even more recently, mammoth hydroelectric projects have come up in the region, and these are based on really placid and hasty environment impact assessments. By the way, just for your information, the Himalayas are known to have the highest dam density in the world. This includes the existing projects, the ongoing projects, and the proposed, and considered to be clean and green source of energy, which is deceptive. Environmentalists are deeply concerned, and they're voicing their concerns over the fallout of impounding rivers and ruthless tunneling, road alignments for heavy machinery, and large-scale deforestation and drying up of water sources that is happening due to impounding of the Himalayan rivers on an insurmountable scale. There are also, in the last decade, there are also mounting tourist footfalls in the region, and these have come up because of new forms of connectivity like the internet. So the virtual connectivity makes it very easy to book accommodation, to explore places, and there's an influx of tourists before the government or the state has a vision to accommodate an influx of this nature. Besides, there has been a total disregard for appropriate traditional design principles for the built environment, as well as the traditional aesthetics that is so typical to this region and worth revering. The intensity of the recent landscape changes can be summarized in a few phrases, the commodification of natural resources, and this really raises long-term sustainability concerns for the fragile landscape. With this brief introduction, I'm going to now move on to my presentation on Chilgoza pine, which is the focus of our study today. Okay, just give me a minute. Okay, so I come to the core presentation, the focus of my presentation today. Before I begin my research study findings or project my fieldwork triumphs and tribulations, I'd like to just pay reverence to Humboldt and his perceptions of research. What really I find inspiring is his whole philosophy about humanizing research. And I seem to be influenced by his principles, where he feels that research should not just be limited to dull and dry and abstract findings and projecting these and exposing these, but field research narratives should also portray all the drive, the eccentricities of the researchers, the adventure, the observation trail, and of course, the academic river. But of course, he also believed that we must reach out to our, to people beyond the scientific fraternity and to make scientific research popular through non-scientific language was something he propagated through his own research exposition and dissemination. But I'd also like to draw your attention to another researcher who I revere, and she is Scarlett Epstein, economist and social anthropologist. And while doing her field research in South India, she was deeply concerned that economists had started delegating field work to others, and they were laying too much emphasis on the quantum of data collection, quantitative data, while losing contact with reality. And therefore, that the researcher should be personally engaged with the research domain, because personal engagement enhances the reliability of the researcher's data set. And I myself have found engaging with the field area extremely rewarding for a number of reasons. It helps me to grasp not only the overall broad trends, but also helps me to seek complex explanatory processes for deciphering causality, which is not possible by just looking at quantitative trends and data crunching. And therefore, for me, working with secondary data is a virtual no-no. Connecting with your research domain can give an intricate understanding of complexities, but sometimes it also provides opportunities for making discoveries. And that itself is very intoxicating to be in the field for every moment. I also indulge in a research technique, which I have myself developed, of visiting and revisiting my field sites, which I call field stations. And very often, my observation trails are not planned. They're just open-ended, and I'm just kind of observing around if any changes have occurred since I last visited. Is any activity drawing my attention? And that's how I move around from time to time and engage in repeated visits over for a long period of time in my field areas. It's really, in course of one of these unplanned, open-ended observation trails that I was ambling along a village named Kalpa in Kinnaur district, where I found a group of locals huddled around an electric pole, and they were peering over a notice of sorts where names had been arranged in a certain sequence. And that drew my attention. So I mingled with the friendly local community and found out that the notice was signed by the Gaon Vikas Committee. It seems that the list of names actually depicted the rotational distribution of irrigation water across the village community. When I inquired whether other forms of common property resources was also being managed by the Gaon Vikas Committee, that's when they sort of told me that yes, the Vikas Committee also helps in collectively extracting Chilgoza pine nut, and which they were referring to as Gribo Thunk in their language, in their local native language. That's how I stumbled upon Chilgoza pine and started doing some explorations. Apparently, the scientific name of Chilgoza pine is Pinus gerardiana, and this is to commemorate an explorer, British explorer, Captain Alexander Gerard, who in the early 19th century decided to explore this really difficult, impenetrable landscape. And in his travelogue, he described the landscape to be rugged and mountainous in an extraordinary degree. Now, this kind of revelations was indeed very intriguing. I lost no time to venture out on some reconnaissance surveys. And during these reconnaissance surveys, something really was eye-catching is the piles and piles of pine cones that the local villagers were collecting. So essentially, the pine nut that they told me they collect under the governance of the Gaon Vikas Committee is a seed embedded in the pine cone. And this is actually extracted for consumption and sale. And when I saw these huge piles of Chilgoza pine cones being extracted, some kind of, I was sort of alerted, and I sort of, my research spirits got ignited. And I wondered whether, if they are extracting seeds to be sold or consumed as pine nut, and if the extraction was, in such large quantities, would it not threaten the natural regeneration of this species? Or maybe because they have a stake in the resource, because they earn something by selling this resource, maybe they have ways, local management systems to manage the resource and prevent it from degradation. And therefore, my studies started full swing on this species. And I looked at relevant literature, and there were further revelations which were really cause for alert. I found that the global distribution of Chilgoza pine is extremely sparse. It is inherently located. It occurs only naturally in only small patches in the Himachal Himalayas, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and therefore it is an endemic species. It can only survive within this very narrow environmental bandwidth. So along with other concerns that I have just projected, I found out that there are biodiversity concerns, because if this species is threatened, it's going to become extinct because it survives in a very, very narrow, just like the jumping Himalayan spider. Now, it was time to alert the State Forest Department, which are the custodians of these forests. So on my way back to Shimla, I decided to alert the State Forest Department. So I walked into the PCCF's office, the Principal Chief Conservator of Forests, said, look, I think that we need to do a study on the status of the gravity of the situation. This is what's happening. People are extracting. The species is extremely rare, and something needs to be done to protect it. But before that, we need to understand the gravity of the situation. I proposed a field study to understand the nature society interfaces surrounding this resource. My genuine persistence and concerns did not go unheeded, and the study was commissioned by the department immediately. The field study initiative was actually meant to ascertain the status of the forest and also to see and ascertain the nature of livelihood link extraction activities. Of course, the overall assessment and need to bridge the gap between research, policy, and action was an important factor in this whole process. Now, let me just give you some introductory comments on the native habitat of the species. It's extremely water constrained, the steep xeric landscape. It's windy. There are long, dry, cold spells, wide day and night annual temperature ranges and short growing season. The pine is Chilgoza pine is extremely well adapted to these surroundings. It's a hardy species, wind firm, cold and drought resistant, and makes very little demand on the fertility of the soil. This high mountain subalpine pine located at elevations between 1800 and 3500 meters, therefore performs vital intangible hydrological and erosional functions, preventing and regulating the downslope movement of water, soil, as well as snow. It also has very distinct characteristics in comparison to other more cited temperate Western Himalayan pines. For instance, it's identified by its gray, scaly bark. It has, the leaves are needle-like in bunches of three. The cone is extremely large and looks like a pineapple. And of course, the seeds are wingless and large in size. And most pine seeds are edible for human consumption, but they are very small and unwieldy to extract. By virtue of the fact that the seeds are large in size, in the case of Chilgoza pine, locals have been extracting this, and it's amenable for consumption very easily. Because of its livelihood implications, the Chilgoza is not only consumed as a nut during winter months, particularly in the past when very few mountain grains were available for consumption. So it formed an important part of the local diet. But Chilgoza twigs, which have a very high resin content, was the only source of torchlight in these areas where there was no electricity even until the late 60s. And because of these livelihood, dependence on this resource, the resource has been, playing an important role in ritualistic as well as in religious spheres. You find that garlands of Chilgoza are offered to deities. It's a sign of hospitality when a guest appears. I had collected many, and it was a wonderful trekking snack time thing to do, to eat up your garlands. And of course, during weddings and other auspicious occasions, they are offered to the local native population from time to time. Now, locals have customary rights to access this forest, although they are owned by the State Forest Department. And pine nut extraction happens seasonally at the end of September or early October. It's a very difficult and tedious activity and requires great human toil, dexterity, and skill. You have to climb the tree, you have to collect the cones, they drop to the floor, collected, and they're brought to cattle pens to in warm conditions for a day, 15 days. And then each seed has to be manually extracted for the seeds, which are then ready for human consumption. The study that I designed essentially focused on securing a long-run view of nature-society interface along this resource, and the impact of changing contextual domain on Chilgoza pine extraction was the core focus of my analysis. I plan to look at the impact of changing conditions on resource use regimes, on extraction levels, on the methods of extraction, livelihood stakes in the resource, and of course to understand the impact of all this on the Chilgoza forest, and particularly threats to over-extraction of pine seeds and threats to natural regeneration. The study area is that I decided to choose was Kinnaur, because a large fraction of Chilgoza pine forest in the Indian context occurs in Kinnaur. And so this 2,000 hectares odd patch was mapped, and I found that I decided to select 13 representative villages to reflect variations in topography, road access, and demographic characteristics. And I made sure that the villages were covered the entire expanse of the Chilgoza belt very, very effectively, so that I did not miss out any patch of forest. Here is a representation of the topographical characteristics, villages located on either side of Satluj River and its tributaries. So the whole thrust was on primary data collection. I would engage in both quantitative as well as qualitative surveys. Now in these regions, each village, like the village Gyabung here, has a designated patch of forest to access for Chilgoza pine nut collection. And this has been happening since traditional times. They have understanding with other villages who don't enter. They have their own respective patches. And therefore, for my basic sampling unit, the village and each of its surrounding forest patches that they access were neatly mapped out, and they became our basic sampling unit for the socio-ecological study. You can see here, the village, and these are all the forest plots that we did to understand the status of the forest they access. So I was assisted by a team of dedicated field investigators, and they helped me with the household surveys. The household surveys were mostly designed to get data, quantitative data on education attainments, assets, occupation, consumption expenditure, and of course, reliance on Chilgoza pine nuts, as well as extraction methods. But we also did detailed forest surveys as per tools of forestry science to assess the condition of the forest, the heights and girths of pine trees, their, particularly their frequency of occurrence per hectare, and of course, the core analysis, natural regeneration, the occurrence of seedlings and saplings and their health and status. But these quantitative surveys were complemented by detailed ethnographic studies that I engaged in to understand the history of the region and the factors driving transformation and change, and also the sociological impact of these transformation and change on Chilgoza forest and forest dependence. Yes, this is really one of the sessions in progress. And this is Sharan Singh Negi, who is also, I do hope he still survives, the oldest voter in India. Braving the rugged, rocky, steep terrain, befriending the local community, as well as bonding with my field team, who had to face and work in extremely challenging topographical conditions, was very, very engaging and difficult. But on the whole, it was so satisfying, and so my field team was really my crutches in the field. Now coming to the revelations of the study. So let's just quick look at the past. Based on archival records and oral history accounts, I found that the pre-modern times before the 1960s depicted a region characterized by great topographical barriers, inclement weather. The local population was dependent on self-sustaining agro-pastoral livelihood systems, and they had as expected, collective strategies, cooperative methods to engage in labor-intensive activities. The accessibility conditions were very difficult and mostly pastoral trails. Alexander Gerard, in his travel accounts, expresses this very vividly, stating that unstable and dangerously narrow footpaths along steep precipices were the only paths suited. The wealth of the Kinoras, however, which the natural endowments permitted, was the flocks, the large flocks of sheep and goat that they reared. Now, if we look at the extraction of Chilgoza pine nuts in the past, we found through our oral history surveys and other brief archival mentions is that pine nuts were collectively extracted. There were rules of governance that were meticulously implemented through informal monitoring and fear of social opprobrium, as well as the fact that these methods of extraction had religious overtones. Nobody broke rules of access and rules of extraction in these forests. For instance, participation of all households were mandatory. There was a stipulated date which was announced, and nobody could access the forests before that date when the resource was ready for harvest. On that stipulated day, on that day which was announced, only two members, one male and one female from every household, could access these forests and collect as much as they wanted. This was to ensure fair access, and then all the produce that was collected was put together in one location and equally distributed across all members in the community. Now, it seems that most of the pine nut that was collected in those days was mostly for self-consumption, because there was no market access. It appears that meager amounts entered trade of wool and raisins, which the Kinauras took to the entrepot town of Rampur Bushehr, and little amounts of Chilgoza ventured in these trade dealings. But for most purposes, it had no market value. And because the density of population, even today, the density of population in Kinnaur, given the topography, is only 13 per square kilometer. So you can imagine that the demand for the resource only for subsistence from a very low population base, and because of labor resource constraint, not much possibility of extracting too much. Besides, the extraction period coincided with other labor engaging activities like stocking up firewood, fodder, and leaf litter for your cattle pens before the long 6-month winter spell, and also processing all your food grains for winter when you were totally confined to your homes, and the entire region was snowbound, and so there was not much time. And because when I interacted with some of the elderly people and even centenarians, they commented that in those days it was quite common to find Chilgoza pines hanging from the edge of branches even after the collective extraction process had happened. So there was no use collecting beyond subsistence need. Therefore, one could infer that in the past, the natural resource base must have been far in excess of extraction levels, with meager threats to natural regeneration. However, the 60s, the post-60s eras ushered in dramatic change. After the Chinese aggression of 1962, there was a remarkable development all along the Himalayan arc, which happened more for security, anxiety, and strategic compulsion. Thousands and thousands of kilometers of highways came up all along the Himalayan arc. In Kinnaur 2 National Highway penetrated through the core belts of the district in and around the Chilgoza bed, connecting this region to bubbling economic mainstream areas in the urban areas. The road was maintained, and through generous fundings coming from the Integrated Tribal Development Program. And because it was a highway for defense purposes, the border roads organizations made sure that it was open for most times of the year. In more recent times, under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, a network of village link roads have come up, connecting villages. Nearly all villages, which were once extremely remote, are now connected to the highway, which then connects them to centers in the plains, important centers in the plains. So this changing contextual parameters has led to market integration, as one may anticipate. And there has been a remarkable and progressive tilt towards horticulture. Okay. Um, One can, the conditions, the natural endowments in Kinnaur were favorable for cultivation of apples. But the topographical conditions and lack of accessibility has served as a barrier for, entering into the cultivation of apples. Insights from neighboring Kotkar areas in Shimla, where the apple revolution had already occurred, natural endowments and entrepreneurial skills of the Kinnaras who were familiar with trade with neighboring parts of Tibet were essential enabling factors besides the road that really fostered a transition towards horticulture. In 1961, for instance, only 13 hectares in Kinnaur district was under apple cultivation, whereas in 2015, 10,828 hectares came under apple. That is 800 times increase in cultivation hectareage in just 6 decades. In 1970, 85% of cultivated land was under traditional mountain grains. Right? However, our household surveys indicated that in the more present times, 90% of a household's cultivatable land is under orchards. And this is across, very inclusive across all social factions. But the road was also responsible in improving educational attainments, which has been instrumental in accessing government jobs reserved for the native population by virtue of its tribal status. Therefore, this occupational tilt, dramatic occupational tilt towards horticulture and non-farm avenues of employment has led to very high levels of economic prosperity. From our studies on per capita monthly consumption expenditure, we found that in the case of all the villages in Kinnaur that we surveyed and studied, these per capita monthly expenditure levels are higher than the rural all India averages by a factor of 3 and even 5. Now, these developments have been not so desirable as regards pine nut extraction. And now we come to the ultimate impact study on these changing contextual parameters and its effect on Chilgoza forests. For one thing, because the resource originates from a very restricted and rare, it's a rare species, the restricted geographical domain means that it is a very rare resource, and therefore Chilgoza pine nuts fetch a very, very high price in wholesale markets in the plains. And therefore, the sale of Chilgoza pine nuts, unlike in the past when it was used only for self-consumption, has become a very profitable proposition. We found that in our surveys, we found that there has been near total harvesting of pine cones, and nearly 80 to 90% of pine cone collection by every household is entirely for the market, unlike the past when it was entirely for self-consumption. Now, this horticulture biased rural development and altered cone collection exigencies that have shifted towards commercial exploitation has also changed resource use regimes and changed extraction methods with dire consequences for the resource. For one thing, new kinds of time constraints have risen, which is making the locals indifferent towards participation in cone collection activities. For example, peak apple harvesting time coincides with pine collection activity time. So the locals don't have time to participate in the traditional fair and equal collective pine nut collection institutions. And therefore, further, able-bodied people, young adults are away are they either pursuing higher educations or they're engaged in non-farm government jobs. We found that many of our households, one or the other member, are engaged in government jobs. And of course, today with rising levels of economic prosperity and comforts, The local population finds pine nut extraction and processing to be a very tedious activity causing discomfort. So they've started distancing themselves from the resource in these ways. But how have they overcome these problems of non-participation? By engaging a burgeoning pool of migrant labor. And every season, a large quantum of Nepalese laborers can be found in the region. They are very well versed with the mountain terrain, and they are well versed to do load bearing activities, and they are complementing the effort. So most of the pine nut collection that physically happens today is by the Nepalese labor that comes into this region during peak season. But new forms of local institutional mechanisms have also arisen to overcome participation problems. Those villages that are relying heavily on horticulture have in fact started auctioning out their forests, Chilgoza forests, for pine nut collection to thekadars. It's a win-win situation. Locals can focus on their horticulture responsibilities, which fetches them more returns, and the thekadar can earn a huge margin in the wholesale retail and retail markets in the plains. And therefore, it's a win-win scenario for both parties. But in other cases, people have evolved mechanisms of group access. The forests are divided into compartments, and the local villages are divided into groups. Each group is assigned a compartment on a lottery system every year. And if you cannot participate in these group activities, you can designate your Nepali labor to represent you after getting prior approval, or you can tell your neighbor to represent you. Now, I noticed that a number of natives were engaged in these group access mechanisms of access, but their supervisory efforts were mostly to make sure that the Nepalese labor did not stray into the other groups' demarcated forests. It was never to make sure that extraction was happening in a sustainable manner without, damaging the tree. So therefore, locals have started distancing themselves from actual cone collection activities and the resource condition as well. Now, the mechanism of resource extraction has also changed. In the past, you had this long, as you can see in the left, a tool where each cone had to be targeted, twisted and turned and removed. But now that's a very slow way. People are using something called a darati, which is denoted on the right in the illustrated figure. And you can easily climb up a tree and lob branches very, very quickly. However, this has led to excessive lopping, as illustrated below, damaging the forest immensely. Now, our corroborative evidence on unsustainable harvesting emerged from the forest survey. We found that 65% of the trees had very high or high levels of lopping. Now, excessive lopping of the branches, which means you're getting, trying to extract by just getting rid of a large fraction of the branch, affects growth and metabolic process of the pine tree, of the branch and the pine tree. But also it reduces potential cone formation on the branches. Besides, what I found through my studies was that the pine cone takes nearly 18 months to mature. Meanwhile, the next year's pine cones are also visible on the branch. So if you're not careful while extracting the mature cone, you're likely to also cause damage to the next year's yield. And there was evidence of damage to next year's crop all along the forest floor. But declining yields are also attributable to, sort of encroachments in the forest to expand orchards, for haphazard road construction, and of course, hydropower projects. Our interactions with the local communities indicated that over the last 25 years, on an average, Chilgoza yield from forests have declined by 50%. The coming up of, here's what's happening due to hydropower projects. The Tidong hydropower project has led to damage to 13,000 mature trees. So in the present, a vicious cycle of high and unsustainable lopping, declining yields and rising prices has led to threat to the resource to an unsurmountable proportions. We found that 90% of the plots evaluated post extraction had no cones on the branches. When we looked at the status of natural regeneration, it was a very, very dismal scenario. And here are the tribulations of field research. We found that, and this is how we try to anticipate and estimate and depict how natural regeneration is good or bad. Actually, the ideal scenario is to have an inverted J. We look at the population distribution of the forest, the seedlings, the saplings, the frequency of seedlings, saplings, and trees per hectare. And ideally, you need a large number of seedlings because they are likely to face all kinds of threats and mortality situation till they graduate to become a tree, right? So the ideal scenario is an inverted J-shape. What we found is a dismal picture. We found a J-shaped scenario. And this kind of situation was consistent across all the forests, across all villages. Therefore, the young recruits, seedlings and saplings, are insignificant to sustain the current forest stock that is likely to age away, threaten to become extinct. Now, these findings also questioned commonly held paradigms of on the environment development discourse, and I'm going to be really quick at this now with time running out. In the post-industrial revolution era, particularly during the 20th century, deforestation was rampant all along the Western world and in other parts as well. A number of, because of industrialization, rapid spread of industrial agriculture, ranching, mining, and the whole thrust of forest policy at that time was to create protective reserves, because the policy visionaries at that time felt that if we don't create reserves, all forests would be wiped out. However, during the mid-80s, another kind of thinking began that, because of these forest reserves, a lot of marginalized poor populations dependent on forest resources were getting displaced because of these policies of overprotection of forests. And therefore, it might be better to initiate liberal conservation paradigm oriented policies where you allow the local forest dependent populations to extract non-timber forest produce such as chilgoza, and since they rely on the resource, they will make sure that the forests are not going to degrade. However, over a period of time, even this policy was challenged as ecologists found that bad and excessive extraction of non-timber forest produce led to adverse ecological consequences. We just noticed what has happened to natural regeneration. The second paradigm or trope that is often found is that poverty causes environmental degradation. But in our case, our findings indicate that a relatively economically prosperous region can also, people from such regions can also be responsible for degrading their environment. And I tried to find out that what was this fury of pine cone collection all about? Because when I compared income from apple and chilgoza, I found that the income from apple is many more times higher than the mean income from chilgoza pine. And then what is the incentive to collect? The reason is that in a day you really make a lot of money commensurate with the effort you put in. So you can even earn, in some villages they earn 40,000 in a day of that collective extraction. And there is also uncertainty about future returns, declining yields, and maybe, the government will come in, the state forest department will come in and alert them and say, okay, look, the forests are degrading. Your customary rights of access are going to be taken away. So again, it's better, with all these uncertainties, to focus on short-term gains and not think about long-term ecological implications. And so the overall conservation and environment depicted in my study was one of negligence, both the inability of the state or the local community to upscale recruitment, natural regeneration, or to promote sustainable management. When I look closely at the local mechanisms of managing the resource, I found that their management principles were oriented more towards equitable resource of whatever they were collecting and not towards sustainable extraction or conserving the resource. So it was a really sad, dismal scenario for me. However, I didn't give up and continued my observation trails. And in course of my further observation trails, I noticed something really peculiar. Since the focus of my analysis was on natural regeneration, I made sure I'd photo documented all seedlings and all saplings that I had encountered in the forest transits all across the study area. And when I looked at photographs of this in sequence, I found some peculiar things. Regeneration was happening in very inexplicable locations. And I tried to find out how the cone could reach here. How do the cones from the seeds or the seeds from the cones could reach these weird locations? I also found clustered seedling growth or clumping of, and then of saplings. And then the locals kept telling me about the common crow's affinity to hide pine nuts. And then something strange happened. One morning when I was with my field team in one of the high altitude forest patches, I noticed a lot of bird activity. I thought that, the noise was from a very determined woodpecker, the pecking by the woodpecker kind of sounds. And then I spotted a bird. It was perched on one of the Chilgosa pine cones. I took the photograph on my simple point and shot camera and came back to Delhi. And then when I identified the bird, I learned extremely interesting things. And I didn't know that I was on the verge of making an important biological interaction, mutualism discovery. And this is what I found, that the bird was the greater spotted nutcracker, and it is found only in Chilgosa forests. It's native to the northwestern Himalayas, and it is also an endemic species. Wow, what a revelation. And I tried to unravel the mystery of the bird I found that there's not much literature, academic literature and research on this species of nutcracker found in the Chilgosa forest that I had photographed. But there was a lot of research on another similar nutcracker in the western temperate region known as the Clark's nutcracker. So I looked at literature by Hutchins and Lanner, as well as Diana Tombach, and found amazing things. Apparently, out of 120 species of pines that are there are 20 that have seeds which are not dispersed by the wind because they are wingless and large. Okay, these are not susceptible to dispersal by wind, as you can see. And the bird plays an important role in dispersing Chilgosa seeds. So what I found that the clustering of seeds and the location of little saplings and seedlings in below rocks and in locations that couldn't have happened through wind dispersal could have been nutcracker clashes. So here is how it all happens. The nutcracker depends on pine nut seeds for its survival, especially during autumn season, and it amasses seeds. It has a pouch below its neck that it can store 90 seeds at a time. And during a whole season, it can cache as many as 10,000 seeds across a wide expanse of Chilgosa pine forests, including to extents of 4 to 5 to even 32 kilometers. And it has a great spatial memory. Whatever it can't retrieve, though it doesn't consume so much, then regenerates and becomes a pine tree. Nutcrackers are therefore known to facilitate regeneration and even colonization. And both the tree and the bird have co-evolved with morphological characteristics to facilitate this kind of bird pine mutualism. Nutcrackers are known to be primary seed dispersers. They cache well beyond their needs. They cache at depths to reduce predation by other prey and desiccation, and they cache in sites favorable for what are the kind of policy implications that come from the study? I think here are some that I summarize, and all of you as policy studies experts must have already started thinking in these lines based on my research study and my exposition to the fragile Himalayan systems. So one is, I think we need to do research on ecological values of the species. We need to sort of come up with innovative participatory institutional mechanisms based on new forms and innovative forms of citizen science to make the locals more ecologically responsible citizens of the belt. We need to do some design interventions, maybe design a sustainable extraction tool, and disseminate it across. We cannot tell the community not to extract because it is something, a resource that they've been doing and they have customary rights to extract, but we can educate them by designing tools to ensure sustainable extraction. And then we can also give them marketing incentives for sustainable extraction through arrangements like eco-certification. And of course, one of the most cost-effective strategies that we can implement straight away without further ado is to ensure greater nutcracker visitations and create situations that will facilitate nutcrackers to come and disperse. And this is the most cost-effective strategy that comes to my mind. I can see that Chitranjali is giving me some deadlines, so I have 2 more slides to alert. Given that climate change in the Himalayas is a very grave scenario, there is concern for tree-lined species like the Chilgoza pine. I've already illustrated why. There are also concomitant threats from pests and pathogens which are increasing in these areas as global warming happens. And therefore, there is a need to recategorize the species from near threatened to endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Rare Species. And this is deeply warranted to draw greater awareness and undeterred conservation focus. Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience. I now close and stop sharing my screen and look forward to an invigorating discussion.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the session. And we're so sorry that we were delayed by a few minutes. Otherwise, we would have more time for asking questions to you. But still, there are 2 questions from Apala. I just want to ask Apala, do you want to ask the questions yourself, or shall I just read it out?
Hi, Apala. It would be lovely to hear you. Hi, Apala. Can you hear her, Chitranjali?
No.
I think she's on mute. I guess.
Hello.
Hi, Apala.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, Professor. Yeah.
Hi,
No,
hi,
sorry, I was really interested in Jesus. Yeah, Professor, I'm pursuing similar research in Ladakh. So
very nice.
That's why I was actually really interested in your talk.
Thank
so
you
there
so
are a couple
much.
of questions I've written them down on the chat box also. In case you can't hear me, you can just move on. Yeah. First,
Chitranjali, I can hear you. Can you please voice her question?
Yeah, sure. Apala, I'll tell your questions. I'll read it out to them because your voice is breaking. She has 2 questions. First is a bit on the logistical side. It says, how do you support your research as an independent social scientist? What avenues of funding can we as researchers can explore? So what are your advice for, because like Apala mentioned, she's doing a similar independent research study in the region of Ladakh. So I think her question comes from that experience that she's having herself. So what suggestions would you have for her? And once you answer this, I'll ask you the other question.
Okay. Okay. That funding woes are the greatest hindrances to research for an independent researcher. From my personal experience, I think that I've been really lucky so far. I've been able to, get support. It's not easy at all because your credibility is always assessed if you don't have institutional affiliation. But I think the best way is to disseminate your findings through publications and constantly look for, research avenues and funding avenues that specifically honor, the position of an independent researcher. It's definitely very, very difficult. So, yes, but there are sources that you can tap. You just need to list them out and keep track of sites that specifically fund independent. There are interesting sites like the National Geography, the Ruford Small Grant funding that is there, and several others that actually allocate researchers specifically for dynamic youngsters who value adventure in very inhospitable spaces. So Apala, you really have a very good chance there to become a lead national geography researcher.
Thank you. And shall I ask her second question?
Yes.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, awareness drives do not necessarily work in promoting the conservation of the existing resources. So how can we counter such ongoing issues? Any possibilities of working with policymakers on better intervention mechanisms?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, yeah, it's a very intensive study, and there were many parts to it. There was only one interface with the state that I mentioned in my talk, which is how I just involuntarily and just instantly decided to go and talk to the state forest authorities, and they did give me a patient hearing, and I was just lucky they did. It's extremely important to interface with the state, for instance, especially in the sphere of forest, because they are the ones who are the custodians of forests. And my study did take a sorry turn because on the basis of my findings and evidence-based findings, 2 crores was immediately siphoned to carry implementation work forward, right? However, the government changed from Congress to BJP, and the PCCF got transferred. So the new PCCF who came was not as dynamic, and the project got completely stalled. So one does face all these repercussions, but as I felt, the best way is to try and not give up in disseminating your efforts, reaching out to them. As I said, I went and knocked at the door of the PCCF and he didn't throw me out, so you need to find avenues and ways of publishing, presenting your work, and not giving up opportunities to go and access these departments and talk to people and see if you can be heard. But of course, I feel that if the last resort is to seek institutional affiliation or access institutions who care for forest conservation and who might be interested in conservation concerns in the Ladakh area, and maybe you can tap them as well and collaborate with them as an independent researcher and use their institutional platform as a way to seek funds. That could be another very strategic mechanism you can use to spread awareness, to get funds, as also to keep your freedom in exploring the research domain. That's the reason why I have kept my independent researcher status, because there is nothing binding on me. But then, you have to try out these strategies, and I think something should work.
Right. Thank you. And anybody else in the audience wants to ask any question before we?
Feel free. I have lots of time. I love interacting with students, and time is just no bar for me. So go ahead. Apala says she wants to share my slides. I think I have copies of my slides. Just don't make sure it gets viral and you use it only for your own personal connecting, because maybe I was rushing through it, and you can take a closer look at it, and you can even call me and connect with me. I will be happy to sort of have discussions with you, because we both work in similar kinds of terrain, or anybody else who has anything. I have my contact with my dear colleague Chitranjali, and she can put you in touch with me. I'm very, very open when it comes to students. In fact, one of my motivations to carry on my studies and to bring about change is through my students. I hope always that I can motivate my students. If I couldn't do it, at least my students can. So feel free to access me in any possible way. Yeah.
Ma'am, I had a question. Not a question actually, but have you worked in lake conservation, or have you studied lake conservation at all specifically?
Lake? What conservation, my dear?
Lakes.
Lake?
Yes.
Lakes?
Yeah, the ecosystem.
Water bodies.
Yeah, yes.
Oh, yes. It so happens coincidentally, I'm currently also tracking a wetland, which is actually a lake that has formed by impounding the river Bias in Kangra. And I'm working in this, I'm monitoring this belt for the last maybe a decade or so. I keep going there. And it's a fact. So if you want, if you have time, and Chitranjali, if I can take a small brief spell to sort of talk about my research here, if that's what duty wants me to do.
Yeah, I was
yes, Chitranjali, may I could.
I was working on.
Okay.
So I'd like to hear you.
Okay, so this is a or whatever, because I'm still working on it, but it fact that it is, again, it's an accidental lake that has formed by a dam causing displacement, but it has also led to a very interesting phenomena. After the dam was completed and the lake was formed, it became a wonderful site to attract migratory birds, such as the bar-headed geese, which are the highest flying birds in the world, from Central Asia and Mongolia. And every winter they come here to sort of roost in the winter months and feed and grow till they go back to their breeding sites in Central Asia as summer comes. And the whole study is to understand the wildlife, nature, water, wildlife, and people interface and interactions, and what sort of conflicts arise, and what are the kinds of coexistence that the local populations are fostering, and how has the state or the forest department or the wildlife department, what is its role in fostering conflict or in fostering coexist or in disrupting coexistence. So I could share my abstract, or maybe I could present this study sometime in future with to you folks with Chitranjali's consent. And again, we could do this as a case study analysis, and I could speak to you about what kind of policies and long-term conservation policies can happen. Yes, so do we have any other questions?
Thank you.
I hope the talk was clear. I'm sorry it was a bit long, but I think it's a good idea, Chitranjali, if you can share the slides for their personal use. Not to make, please don't make it viral, because
the session is getting recorded, and like I mentioned you earlier to you, we will have the recording with us and we'll share with the students. So I think if they want, they can
very well
refer to the recording.
Listen to the recording.
Yeah. I just have one question, just the last question
Yes,
before
Chitra.
we end this off, because I've read on your profile that you also take rural field study workshops in the Himalayan foothills for students in IIT Mandi and then Worcester
Yeah.
Polytechnic in US, and also with the urban design students at School
Yes.
of Planning and Architecture. So at JKLU, we have different we promote
Yeah.
a very multidisciplinary study pattern, and we have students from different backgrounds.
Sorry, your voice is cracking.
Sorry,
Hello?
can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Your voice was cracking. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just wondering,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
because
please.
we have
Yeah, I
students
can hear
from.
you.
I was wondering, like, we have students from engineering, design, management, and now we have students from public policy and economics. So how can we engage the students with you, like based on your experience with IIT Mandi and the other institutes that I just mentioned? What are the ways that the students can get a chance to engage with you on your study? Not now, but I know the COVID situation is really restricting any kind of field work, but maybe in future, if the students want to engage and as a program or as a, as a study workshop that we can organize for the students with you.
Right, right. So I do in IIT Mandi in their third year of engineering, they have this program where the students are supposed to survey the villages in the surrounding vicinity, the mountain villages, and then propose policies for them. It could be anything ranging from development issues, health, water, environment, climate change, so on and so forth. And also it could also be like creating a prototype technology for problems related to these dimensions. And I find it fascinating, and I do a very intensive workshop. It's not that it's number of days, but like over 5 days I camp myself there, and it's almost like a 24-hour thing that I do with them, exposing them to the history and the of village studies in India, how to do field work and field research, and also discussing each of their projects also discussing each of their projects, of the proposals and all the initial feedback, whatever inputs I had given them. So that's a fascinating way. There's something that comes to my mind is the wetland study might take me to Rajasthan, because there are certain other wetlands there that I want to study myself to understand human nature and human wildlife coexistence. And that's very close to Jaipur, should be close to Jaipur. And we could always plan out a visit, since you don't have too many students. So when I am visiting these wetlands, they kind of come with me and observe how I observe the wetlands. Meanwhile, we also have indoor workshops, to sort of give them all the tools there, and that would be like a live demonstration
Yeah.
of how to do it. So I see a couple of interesting options that are available to us as soon as
Sure.
the COVID possibility
Yeah.
ends.
We'll
So
keep in
I would
touch.
love to do that.
Yeah.
So we can keep in touch about that.
Thank you. Thank you once again, ma'am, for this talk. And I'm sure
Thank you.
the students have gained a lot of perspective from from the research that you shared with us. And we look forward to collaborating with you for other activities in future.
Very well. I love interacting with an interdisciplinary group of students. So I really look forward to it. Thank you so much, Chitranjali.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.